Now today we are talking about a fish that sort of had a bit of a rough entry into the aquarium trade. It definitely, well, it didn't get off onto the right foot, let's say that. But we'll talk about that more in the video or in a second. And that fish is the celestial Pearl Danio, or CPD as most people call them online. So celestial Pearl Danios, as the name suggests, are a species of Danio, but a small one. And they were discovered back in 2006. Now at this point in the celestial Pearl Danio's life, they were actually known as a Rasbora. They were, what was it, Fireworks Rasbora or Galaxy Rasbora. That we thought they were a Rasbora at this early stage. It wasn't until later that they actually got reclassified as a Danio. Now the funny thing is, when these fish first appeared on the scene, there were a lot of skeptics out there. There was a lot of people who were claiming these fish weren't real or they were computer generated, the photos were false. It was quite a fun, well, not funny I suppose, but quite a weird thing that was going on. It wasn't until a little bit later that obviously more images appeared and people started realizing that these fish were actually real. Now I was actually working in the shop when these fish started hitting the shops in the UK. And it was insane because this tiny little fish was taking the aquarium trade by storm. It was like mental. People were going crazy for them. And the prices were insane. I sort of remember, well, I've been thinking, but I sort of remember about £30 each at one point. I remember someone selling them for. And for a fish that small, they were getting into the prices like some of your rare plecos and things like that. Like £30 for a fish that small was mental back in the day. And I say back in the day like it was a long time ago. This was like, what, 15, 20 years ago maybe? I don't even know. Yeah, about 15 years ago. So I say back in the day like I'm some old timer, but it wasn't that long ago. Now only a couple of years later, the area where these fish were coming from was heavily trampled, the vegetation was ruined, and everything was going quite badly for these fish because, well, there was a lot of unscrupulous people overfishing them. And at one point they thought they had been overfished to near extinction. It was a bad time for these little guys. Now luckily this wasn't the case, but the Myanmar Fisheries Department that looks after all the waterways over there actually banned the export of these fish very quickly because, well, they could see where it was going. It wasn't going anywhere good. Now luckily they got on top of it, they banned the export of it, but we also found out that actually they hadn't been overfished. Well, in a roundabout way. Now the good thing was the original population was left to recover. Brilliant, they were back on track, and there was also other populations found in the local area, so it wasn't just that one initial group that was found, there was actually more of them spaced out, which was great news. Now the good thing was CPDs are really easy to breed in the aquarium, and it wasn't before long that actually people had had great success with spawning them and raising the young. So now they've been found to be easy to breed, they are bred all over the world, and the prices have definitely dropped since those initial high insane prices. Actually breeding, I bred them in the shop I used to work in. I had a, 3-foot planted aquarium, loads of floating plants on the top, and the CPDs just threw out babies, and the babies survived, or not all of them, but a few of them survived. I wasn't even really concentrating on it at the time, it was just something that happened. So maybe these guys will breed a little bit in the future, but we'll talk more about that nearer the end of the video. Now, as I've already touched upon, their natural habitat is teeming with plants and vegetation. The water tends to be quite shallow, like 30 centimetres sort of thing, and it tends to be crystal clear. Now in this natural habitat there are lots of other little Danio species, Divario species, micro Rasboras I think, if memory's right, and also the rosy loach that's in the tank next door. Those come from the same area as well. There is also a snakehead that comes from the area that I was reading about. Never read about it before until I was doing this video, and I thought I'd check that I was right on which species came from the lake. Probably not best to mix them together, it probably wouldn't end well. Temperature wise they seem to be fairly standard. If you aim for that 20 to 26 degree mark, which I'll put Fahrenheit on the screen somewhere, yeah, 20 to 26 degree mark, you're aiming in the middle. I have heard reports of them going down to as low as 15 degrees Celsius, so quite a cool water fish. You could probably keep that in unheated aquariums in most households as long as you've got decent insulation and heating. If it was me, I'd probably keep them somewhere in the middle like I do these guys, 20, 22, maybe up to 26, and they they will get on absolutely fine. Now when it comes to pH in the aquarium and hardnesses, to be honest, these guys come from a neutral to slightly high pH. So aiming around that 7 mark works out absolutely fine. These ones in here, I'll be honest, are being kept in a slightly lower pH, probably 6.5, 6.8, somewhere around there. But that's just because it's my natural tap water. Because they've been bred in the aquarium hobby now for, well, not so long, but quite a while, they do seem to be fairly adaptable to pHs. I would try and avoid your really low pHs and low hardnesses because they probably won't get on well, but that being said, there is probably someone out there keeping them. They do seem to be quite an adaptable fish. As for all your other parameters, your ammonia, your nitrite, your nitrate, your phosphate, it's the same with any other fish. Keep it clean, keep it water changed, make sure there's none of those horrible toxic nutrients in there. They'll get on absolutely perfectly. When it comes to sizing, these fish are tiny. They are, what, 2 centimeters maximum, which is like 0.8 of an inch, I think, if my calculations work out right. So they are a proper diddy tiny little fish. So they're a perfect inhabitant for those smaller little nano tanks because, well, they're tiny and you can tell males and females apart, which I'll tell you about in a minute. Let me get to that point. As for any shoaling fish, really you want to be keeping them in groups. So 6, 8, 10, 12, really the more the merrier. The more you have, the more natural behaviours you'll see, the more confident they'll be. I think I've got maybe 8, I believe, in here. I think that's how many I picked up. It's been a little while since I bought them. And they are out at the front all the time. Really, the only fish that gives them any grief in here is the little dwarf chain loach, which are just, well, they're inhabitant for a minute while I get another tank sorted for them. But they're always out at the front, always asking for food. I do wonder, though, if I was to put them in with, you know, a bigger, faster fish, whether they'd be hiding a little bit more. But it's something you've just got to look at and pay attention to in your aquarium. The only real issue that I do come across is keeping these guys in with bigger, more boisterous fish. They do tend to hold their own, but if they're not allowed to get to the food or they're constantly being sort of chased and kept in the back of the aquarium, they can get skinny and they can, well, starve essentially. So it's well worth teaming them up with other small, peaceful fish, but there's tons of different fish that you can team them up with. I'd probably just be avoiding the really fast, boisterous fish. The males can get a little bit sort of boisterous with each other. It's never anything bad. It's a little bit of chasing and a little bit of squabbling, and that's about it. They don't really have the mouths to cause damage to each other, to be honest with you. They're quite small. So with that lush, planted, clear water, native environment in mind, to be honest, I'd be trying to replicate that in the aquarium. It's not a must though, because again, I'm pretty sure that the majority of these guys coming into the hobby are tank bred. So they've probably never seen their native environment in their lives. But still, it's nice to give them hiding spaces with lots of plant because it's just going to give them cover. It's going to give them places to lay eggs. And again, that clear water, I think it shows off their colours, well, the best. Once you get that tinge sort of black water vibe, the orange in them seems to disappear a little bit. So I think clear water does them best and they look the best in it. But loads of plants teamed up with some hardscapes, so maybe some decent rocks or maybe some bogwood, you'd have to be careful because again, you don't want to bring that pH crashing through the floor. But anything like that, just to give them a little bit of cover and some interest to swim around, will be absolutely spot on for them. When it comes to looking for tank mates with the Celestial Pearl Danio, well, it's fairly easy as long as you're not putting anything in there that's going to eat them. And, well, that's about it, really, to be honest. As I've said, they can be a little bit boisterous and a little territorial. They might chase off the odd fish, but it's never going to come to anything bad. It's a 2 centimetre fish with a tiny little mouth. They're really not going to do anything bad to your other fish. The main thing to be mindful of is making sure that they aren't being bullied and they're not getting scared into the plants and then not coming out. Again, as I've already said, team them up with small fish, you know, your neon tetras, your chili rasboras. I've seen them kept successfully with rummy nose tetra before. All these shoaling small fish that don't tend to be too boisterous work absolutely perfect. They just, well, they work. I would avoid bigger things like tiger barbs and stuff like that because they're probably just going to be a bit big and a bit boisterous. And if those Celestial Pearl Danios get sort of scared, they might not come out and feed, and then, well, you're not going to get the best out of these fish. You need to see these fish up close to really appreciate them, and if they're constantly hiding in the back, well, there's just no point. When it comes to bottom dwellers to live in with them, well, again, they're fairly easygoing. As long as you're not putting anything in there that's going to see them as lunch, you'll be perfect. Obviously, the rosy loaches are a good choice because they are from the same area. If you want to go for that sort of biotope nature aquarium style, then perfect. Another good option is things like Corydoras catfish, because peaceful, small mouth, not going to bother anyone, going to stay on the bottom. Perfect little addition if you want to keep celestial pearls with something like that. Or if you're looking at something to do a bit of algae eating in a big tank, something like a bristle-nosed catfish would be good. Or in a smaller tank, Otocinclus. Perfect little additions in there. Lastly on tank mates, as I've already said, they've got small mouths, they're really not going to bother much. But shrimp, algae eating shrimp, things like amanos and cherry shrimp, again, a perfect little inhabitant to go with them. You can build a wicked little community with loads of small fish, all centred around the CPD. Now, one small fish I wouldn't mix with them is the emerald dwarf rasbora. Now, the reason for this is there's reports of them crossbreeding. Now, I have certainly seen some CPDs in a shop that had more splodges than spots, and they had lines, and yeah, they were a bit weird, and they looked big, like chunky big. I've never seen a CPD that big. So I believe I've seen a crossbreed between an emerald dwarf rasbora and a CPD, but I wasn't 100% sure. But it's definitely worth being aware of, because you don't want crossbreeding of those two species in your aquarium. It'll just end up with a bit mixed and muddled gene pool, and they're both gorgeous fish separately. They don't need to be crossed. It doesn't make anything magical. It's not bright pink, it's not bright blue. Keep them separate, keep them nice, and yeah, perfect. Sorry, I've just seen my cherry barbs spawning in the grass in the back of the aquarium, so a little bit distracted. Feeding CPDs tends to be really simple, to be honest. Anything small that they can fit in their mouths, absolutely fine. I use the micro crumb. Where is it? There it is. So I use the micro crumb because that is already a powdered food. You can crush up granules and flakes and things like that, but give them a good varied diet, they'll do really well. The other thing that you can feed them as a little bit of a treat is obviously frozen foods. If they're big, then bloodworms. These little guys are big enough now and chunky enough to take bloodworm. But if they're smaller, things like cyclops and daphnia, baby brine shrimp, all of those different frozen foods should be readily accepted by them and, well, seen as a little bit of a treat. Now we come to breeding the CPDs, and I'll be honest, it's fairly easy. I've done it by mistake, so it obviously can't be that hard. Now, if you are looking at breeding them, telling males and females apart is fairly simple. Females will be a little bit chunkier and a little bit broader in the body. Males will be a little bit more slender. But the other way to tell is their ventral fins. Males will have bright orange ventral fins, and females will generally be clear. Now, it can be quite tricky as a new person to sort of gauge this, and if they're really young, it might be tricky to tell. But once they get to maturity, really simple, and you can see the definition between the two colours really easily. They will often breed in the aquarium with little to no help from us. Keep the aquarium clean, keep them well fed, good water changes, lots of plants for them to lay the eggs in. They will generally get on with it. Now, most of the time, obviously, if you're keeping them in a community environment, your shrimps, your fish, your catfish, your other inhabitants, and even the parents actually will treat the eggs as a meal. They're not parental, they're not going to protect the eggs. It is fair game once they're released. But sometimes in a heavily planted aquarium, you will get the odd fry or the odd 2 or 3 survive. That's what happened to me back in the day. But if you want the fry to survive, there are some definite things you can do to, well, help you with that. Now, your first thing would be obviously to have a tank with just CPDs in there. Yes, they might still eat the young, but you are less likely to have it if you've got scavengers like catfish and shrimps and things. They're more likely to survive without those hunters in there and just the parents to contend with. Now, setting up a tank with a little bit of Java moss, well, I say a little bit, quite a bit of Java moss in there for them to lay the eggs in, and the more hiding spaces the better. Or even making your own spawning mops at home and having somewhere for them to lay the eggs. That'll be the first point of call, because that's just going to give them the medium to be able to lay all their eggs in. Now, as I've already mentioned, once the eggs are laid, the parents will generally try and eat them, unfortunately. And there's not too many eggs laid in one go. They'll breed often, they'll breed fairly regularly, but they don't lay too many eggs at one time in my experiences, so it's easy for all the eggs from one spawn to disappear very quickly. So the more hiding spaces you can give them, maybe even taking the Java moss out and putting it in a little breeding trap, or maybe even taking the parents out once you've seen them spawn, it just depends on how big a group or how big a yield of babies you want. Now, once you have the eggs, they will generally hatch within 2 or 3 days, and then probably 3 or 4 days you'll find that the fry will be free swimming. This can depend on temperature though. The warmer it is, obviously the quicker this will all happen. Now, once the fry are free swimming, to be honest, you can start offering them food. So things like the micro crumb, crushed up foods, the prepared fry foods that you can buy off the shelf, which are specifically designed to grow baby fish up, micro worm cultures, maybe even baby brine shrimp. These fish are tiny when they're born, so you do have to offer them some really small foods, but I don't tend to find them that hard. Again, I wasn't really feeding anything specific back in the day when I bred them, so I wouldn't worry too much. Just offering them small amounts of food and regularly, you should get a decent amount of the babies surviving. And there you go, that's it. It's really not that difficult. I'm actually tempted to clear some of the fish out in here, some of the catfish and some of the Amano shrimps. Oh, and that betta that hunts around here and patrols. Because I think now that these have got a little bit of size to them, and I have seen a bit of spawning behaviour and the males sort of wrestling the females into the plant, I think we could see some breeding in here. So it might be the case, but at the moment I'm just enjoying keeping them in a community tank environment, and well, that's just a choice you need to make. So there you go. I hope you found it useful. I hope you found it interesting. Now you know, hopefully, enough about CPDs to succeed with keeping them and maybe breeding them. So anyway, watch out for future videos, lots more coming, fish farms and this and that, and setting up tanks and ponds and all the usual good fishy aquarium wet stuff on this channel, as you are used to. I'm going to stop talking now because I'm waffling, so I will see you in the next one.